Would you like to spice up your drop-downs? Well, I've got just the thing for you. How do you use Quasar's drop-downs basically? First and foremost, we need to learn what Quasar's definition for drop-down is, which is in their case, it's select. So the QSelect component has two types of selections, meaning the single and the multiple. So what that means is you have a drop-down that you can either use the single mode wherein you select one item at a time, or the multiple mode wherein you can select multiple items in your drop-downs. So the question now is, how do we implement such feature? So going through here, you can see that they have a set of design previews that you can use in order to implement your Quasar drop-downs, which is in their case, the select. So in our case, what we're going to do is we're going to implement it on our side as well. So first, we have this code right here, right? So in our sample app, we have currently a input text field. So we're going to add something else to it. So this time we're going to add a select. So first, in order to create a select, what you need is a list of options. So as you can see here, they have an array of text. So first, in order to implement a dropdown, you need to create a list of options. So in this case, we're going to add options, which is an array. So let's add the users, let's say sex, for example. So let's say male, and then let's add another one, which is, let's say, female. So now you have two choices, right? So now that you have two choices, what you need to do next is to create the select component itself. So in order to do that, you need to add a QSelect. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to bind the vModel to the select component, which is the array we just created earlier. So in this case, we're going to add options. So let's remove the $sign, and then let's add a label. Let's say sex, example. So now we have a dropdown, right? Oh yeah, so it was inside the form data object, so form data dot options. So as you can see, now we have a dropdown. So going back in our code here, you will see that we now have a dropdown, right? But the thing is, we don't have a vModel yet. So what we did was we bound the options array into the vModel itself. But the thing is, that's not how it should be. First, we need to create a vModel for that. I'm sorry for that. So let's say sex to map. Now we have a vModel for this one. So let's replace this one with the vModel. So now it is going to, let's say, form data. So there you go. Now what happens is whenever we input something, it's going to save it in this model, right? So next, we need the options themselves. So in order to do that, we need to add the options property. And then let's add the previous options that we just created right here. So let's add form data.options. So let's remove this one, and then let's bind this one like this. So to make things much more readable, let's just make this a little bit readable. So let's do just this. Okay. So now it's a bit more readable. So let's do that with the other one as well. So now, as you can see, they are all much more aligned, right? So in this case, we created a dropdown, right? So if I select this, you will see that it has the certain value as well. So now that we have a basic dropdown working, what we need to do next is to style it and customize it based on our styling needs. So in this case, as you can see, the previous design concepts, which was available in the text field, which was we discussed previously on the video, is also applicable in this case. So they have the same parameters. So you can either set this one as field, let's say field, just to demonstrate. So as you can see, they perform the same as well. So in this case, we can simply use the outline. So let's use the outline. And then let's imitate the look and feel of the previous field, which is your name, as you can see right here. So like that, so it has a validation as well. So in this case, let's add the rounded. Let's also add the color. So let's add the color, which is just the same. So teal. Let's also add the rules, which is pretty much the same as well. So like that. What happens is, if we don't select a value, it's going to throw an error as well. In this case, they now have a validation. So let's type here my name, just for the sake of examples, and then let's set this to male. So now we have a working dropdown, right? So now that we've got that covered, which is the basics itself, we now move on to decorators. So what do you mean by decorators? So as you can see in this example, basically decorators are some of the ways that you can customize your dropdown to your needs. So in this example, they added an icon, which is what you can also use. So in order to implement an icon, you simply need to use the vslot parameters. So in our case, in order to do that, let's add an icon, right? So let's add an icon to our QSelect. So like this one. So first, what we need to do is we need to add a template. And then let's use the vslot prepend. Meaning we're going to prepend something to the element itself. So in this case, in order to add an icon, let's simply use a Q icon, and then let's use the person as the icon, just for the sake of examples. So now, as you can see, we added an icon in our dropdown right here. You can do that the same as well with the previous text field, but in this video, we're going to focus more on the dropdown element, which is what we created right here. So in this case, we now have a prepend. So aside from that, you can also add your elements to the end. So aside from prepend, you can also append. In this case, let's say you want to append, just to demonstrate. So let's add a template, and then let's use the vslot append. So let's use again the Q icon, let's say, and then let's use the same icon, just for the sake of examples, So once we have that, you can see that the icon appends itself to the end of the form, right? So which is the dropdown itself. So you can use this as a way to customize your content. Also, do take note that template blocks allows you to declare HTML elements inside of it. So in this case, what we did was we simply used a Q icon. But aside from Q icons, you can see in this example as well that they use Q icon. Right, they use the Q icon. They also use the Q avatar, which is, if you take a look at the screen, you can see this one right here. So they used a Q avatar for that. So you're not limited mostly to Q icons only, but you can also use Q avatars as well. Or rather, let's say you can use simple text as well, like this example here. So you can use a label for that one. So the template slots allows you to customize your dropdowns aside from the basic functionalities that they have. Next, we can also apply coloring to our dropdowns, which is the same with our previous component, right? So in this case, let's add some coloring to it as well. So let's say by now we have a teal color, meaning if we select a option here, we have a teal color, right? But we can set the background color to it, or rather we can set its background color differently as well. So you simply need to add a class, let's say BG blue. As you can see, we have a blue background. But aside from the class, in order to implement that much better, we can use the BG color property instead of the class. So you don't want your form to look something like this, you need to use the BG class, BG color property. And then let's set it to blue, for example, or let's say teal, because teal looks nice. So as you can see, we have a custom background color here as well. So let's remove that for now. Let's just stick to the color teal. So based on their examples as well, you can set the colors of the text, you can set the background color of the form itself, which is the dropdown, and you can set custom colors as well. So as you can see, they have a custom color for the icon only, or you have a custom icon or custom colors for the labels or for the options. So it all depends upon you as to how you would like to customize your dropdowns. Next, we have the clearable property. The clearable property basically allows you to clear the contents of your choices. Meaning, if you have selected something, if you click the X button, it's going to clear that for you. So in order to implement that, you need to simply add a clearable property right here. So once you do that, it's going to add a clear icon around here. But in order to fully implement that, you need to add a clear icon, which is in this case, let's simply use the close. And then let's remove the template vslot append in order to allow the dropdown to have a close icon right beside it, right? So if I click this one, it's going to empty the field. So it allows us to clear the contents of the, the form itself, which is the dropdown in this case. So aside from that, you can also disable your dropdowns. So in order to disable, you can simply add a disable. So by adding a disable property, your dropdown is now disabled. So if you want to toggle this property, you can use a custom binding, for example. Let's say disable is equals to true. So what it's going to do is it's going to resolve to true, and then it's going to disable the dropdown. In case you want to enable it again, you simply add a false and hit save. So as you can see, it's now enabled. So aside from the bindings, you can also bind these values to the V model itself. So you can toggle the contents based on certain events or based on certain values. So you can do just that. So aside from the disable and read only, you also have slots with Q button type submit, which is in this case, we have menu transitions, right? So in this case, let's say you want to customize the transition of your menu. In order to do that, you simply need to add a transition show. So if you add a transition show, let's say flip up or flip down, whenever you click the drop down, the transition show is going to set the specific transition based on what you selected. Also, if you select transition hide, or if you set the transition hide value, whatever you put there is going to be the transition for your closing animation, right? So in this case, let's use the scale, for example. So in order to do that, you simply need to add a transition show, and then let's set to scale. Next, we're going to add a transition hide, which is scale as well. So now we have a animation for our dropdown, as you can see right here. But since scale looks a bit weird, we can change its specific, let's change the animation to jump instead. So let's say jump down, or jump up. In this case, let's use jump down. So jump down, jump down, jump down, right? So once we set that, what's going to happen is if I click our drop down, it's going to jump downwards, as you can see right here. So it looks pretty nice if you take a look at it. So it slides a bit downwards, right? It gives you a sliding feel. So that's the animation that is aimed by the jump parameter. So aside from animations, you can also set the display mode for your options list. So in this case, you can set a filter like this one. Let's show the options in menu. So aside from that, or rather what this means is your options list display mode allows you to show like this one. So by default, the options is displayed in a menu type of container. But in the case of you want to show your content in a dialog, you can do that as well by simply setting the behavior parameter. So if you set the behavior to menu, so it's going to behave like a menu. But in the case of, let's say you want to make it behave like a dialog, you simply set the behavior parameter to dialog. So if you take a look in our code, or if you try it implementing in our code as well, you simply need to add a behavior, and then let's set it to dialog. So what's going to happen is if I activate our dropdown, it's going to show us a dialog, which is this one. So I can choose male or female, and I can click the X button to clear the property. So that is just one way of customizing your drop-down's behavior. So you have a lot of options for behavior as well. So aside from dialog, you also have menu. So next, we head now to the model. Now, do take note that your drop-downs model is based on your drop-down mode. So in the case of single, it can be anything. It can be a string, or it can be an object, or it can be an integer, or a decimal, or something like that. Or it can be anything. But in the case of multiple selections, there is a caveat, meaning in order to implement multiple selections, you need to have an array as a V model for that. Now, the question is, why is that? The thing is, that's how it should be, because if you select multiple values in our options dropdown, it needs to add its values in an array, right? Because you can't store multiple values in an object, and you definitely can't store multiple values in a string or in a integer. So the array allows you to add and remove multiple values simultaneously. So that is the reason why it must be an array. Because if you take a look at their examples, you can select multiple values like this one. So in order to set a multiple, or rather let's say if you want to use a multiple type of dropdown, let's say in our case, we want to make it multiple, let's try adding more options. So instead of the sex, let's make it, what do you call this? Let's say favorite colors. So let's set this to favorite colors. And then let's set this to red. Let's say blue. And then let's set to green. And then let's say yellow. And then let's set to teal. You know, our favorite color is teal. So now that we have these 5 options, what we need to do next is to set our V model to an array. So the purpose of setting this into an array is to again allow us to add multiple values and remove multiple values as well. Now that we have that ready, the last thing we need to add in our dropdown is the multiple property to indicate that our dropdown allows multiple values. So we need to do, or rather, in order to implement that, we simply need to add multiple property here. So what's that going to do is it's going to allow you to select multiple values. So as you can see, I can select and deselect multiple values at my discretion. So that's the reason why you need to use an array in order to implement such feature. So now that we have a basic dropdown, which allows us to rather perform multiple selections, we can customize that as well by, let's say, adding a counter. So if you say you want to add a counter, you simply need to type counter here, and then you need to select values. And as you can see, you have your counter right beside your dropdown to indicate how many items you have selected. So in the case of let's say you want to customize the label for the count, you can also set that as well. So you can simply add a hint. By adding a hint, you will add a small, what do you call this? A small label below the dropdown itself. So in this case, let's add a hint of, we call this, number of colors, let's say. Or for example, let's say number of colors. So something like that. What it's going to show us is we have a hint here of number of colors, and then we have a value right here. So now we can set to red, blue, green, for example, and it's going to count 3, right? So aside from having that counter, you can also allow, or rather, you can also set a maximum selection. For example, let's say you want a maximum of 2 items. You can also do that. So in order to implement that, you need to simply add a max values. So let's say max values is, let's say 2. So you have a 2 maximum number of colors, for example. So now that we have that, as you can see, it now appends a slash and a 2 to indicate the number of items that you are allowed to select. So as you can see, once I have selected 2 colors, I can't select anymore. So it's not working anymore. to indicate that I've selected the maximum number of colors. So that is one feature of the dropdown that allows you to select multiple values and then limit those values based on your definitions. So in our case, we limited it to 2 contents, right? So this time, let's move to the options itself. So for the options, you either have a string or an object. So in the case of object, what happens is, let's start with the string first. So if you choose a string, definitely you're going to get a string as a value. So that means, or rather what that means is your array of choices for the dropdown contains a list of strings. Meaning, I have, if you take a look at their code, you have an array full of strings, right? But in the case of object options, what you're going to get is a list of objects, meaning you have an array of objects which contains specific key and value pairs. So what's the difference between the two? The objects notation or the objects option or the object options allows you to customize your options content aside from the textual content itself. For example, in this case, you have a label which allows you to set the label of your dropdown. You have a not dropdown, but the value of your choice. You also have value, which is the intrinsic value of the choice in terms of programming. So you can, let's say you want to have a label of a string, and then let's say you want to have a value of an integer. So that allows you, or the object options allows you to do that. Next, you can set a description as well. Let's say, in this case, if you select Facebook, or let's say in this case, this example, you will see that it has selected the object, right? It can, or aside from selecting the object, you also have all of the contents of the object included in the choice as well. So in several occasions, this proves as a useful feature because it allows you to programmatically navigate your code in a sense that it allows you to customize your content based on a object and not just a string. So there are specific use cases that this is a a very useful feature. So in this case, let's check out the emit value. What's the difference between emit value and map options this time? So for the emit value, what's it going to do is, first, in order to understand emit value, let's take a look at the object first, right? So here you can see that they have a object, or rather an array of objects. So you have a label of string, and then you have a value of a different type. So what happens when you choose emit value is, whenever you select a dropdown, so let's pull it over right here. If you select this one, instead of using the label as the value, it uses the actual value as the value. So there are cases where you want to do just that. For example, you want to, based on Quasar's definition, if you use emit value, the model becomes the determined value of the options. So that means if you set the label differently and then you set a value, so there's an object, right? So you have a label and value. Whenever you choose an item, what's going to happen is the value is going to be used as the selected option. But in the case of map options, it is the other way around. When the map options is used, if you select this one, you're going to get the value in the model, but what the dropdown is going to display to you is the label itself. So that's the key difference. If you use an emit value, like this one, it's not going to display the label, but rather it's going to display the actual value, right? But if you use map options, it's going to display the label value in your selection, but the vModel itself is going to have the actual value, which is indicated by the value property of your object. So that's the difference between the two. So aside from those, you can also have custom prop names. So what does this mean? So basically, what it does is, let's say if you select this one and then select this one, as you can see, by default, Quasar looks at label, value, disable, and sanitize props of each option from the options array objects. But you can override those as well. So as you can see here in this example, you have a model, which is the value, or the model itself, rather the V model of the dropdown, has the value which is different from the value of the dropdown, as you can see in the screen, right? So you can apply that to your dropdowns as well. So you can customize your menu options. So in order to customize your menu options, what you need to do is, first, you need to select, or rather, yes. So in order to implement that, you need to add a template for your dropdowns. So in this case, they added a vSlot parameters to their QSelect. So in case you want to implement this, you need to first create a template with a vSlot option of scope. And then you need to create a Q item which is bound to the scope that item props. So with those in mind, you can now create your own, your own options slot. So in this case, what they did is they customized the options slot, right? So they applied an icons to their dropdowns as well as certain, or rather customized the contents of your dropdown. So it allows that as well. So let's say you want options, or in this case, they customize the, they customize the template by using a toggle option. So in this case, you can select multiple values, but what it does is rather it triggers the toggle option inside the list, as you can see right here. So you can have a myriad of possibilities in terms of customizing your options. So that's using prop names, you can customize your drop-down content. So you can either add an icon to it or you can add another component. So the choice is up to you. So aside from that, you also have lazy loading. Now, what is lazy loading? So lazy loading is basically a feature that allows your dropdown to render content when it is already open, as you can see in this example. So in this example, they imitated the notion of fetching data from the backend server. So while it is loading, it's not going to display data yet, right? So once the data arrives, that is the only time it displays the data. But the thing about lazy loading is, once the template itself loads, it's never going to display it immediately yet in the DOM. Rather, what's going to happen is it's going to wait for you to click the drop down first before rendering the data itself. So that's what they meant by lazy loading. You also have what they call dynamic loading options. So what it does is it renders a certain number of options, and then once you reach the end of the line, it loads another set of options. Meaning it lazy loads your future values in a sense that it conserves computational power as well as saving you lots of CPU resources, because the initial values are not yet rendered, are only rendered when needed in the first place. So as long as they're not yet needed, they are not yet rendered. So aside from that, you also have a cover mode. So what cover mode does is it covers your dropdown itself. So in order to implement that, you need to simply add a options cover. So what it does is, whenever you select something, it covers your options dropdown. So it is applicable for those use cases where you need to do just that example. As you can see, a dropdown covers mostly our selection features, right? So if I select this color and then click away, you can see that it works as intended. So for now, let's just remove the options cover because it's not what we have in mind. But in the case of in case you want to implement that, you simply need to add an options cover parameter in your dropdown. Next, you have the display values. So in the display values, you can customize it in a sense that you can predetermine or you can add a placeholder to your content. So in this case, you have a custom display value. So in order to implement that, you need to simply use the display value property right here. So in our case, if we grab that text here, so what's going to happen is we're going to display the value of, let's say, colors, right? So colors. And then what we're going to do is we're going to check if, so we have sex, right? So let's change this to colors instead. And then let's grab this one. Let's set it here. So there, what we need to do is, let's remove this one, and then let's set this to form data.colors instead. So what's going to happen in our dropdown is, as you can see, it looks something like that. So basically what we did was, it's akin to adding a text first before displaying the actual value. So in this case, we added the text colors first, and then that's the only time we displayed the values themselves. So what it means is we can customize our content based on the display value that we want to have. So in this case, we customize the display value. So aside from the display value, you can also set your choices in the form of chips. So in order to set that, you need to simply use the specific parameter, which is, in this case, use chips. So aside from getting the typical string values, what you're going to get is a chip like this one. So in order to remove a value, you simply need to click the X button near the chip itself. As you can see, it works like that. So let's select again two options, and then let's remove them by clicking the X, and they're gone as well. So you can add and remove specific values based on the choose button of each chip. So you can set also the item slot. So in this case, they created a custom item slot which allowed them to add icons to their choices. So in this case, they combined chips with icons. So as you can see, they simply added a template for the specific Q chip. So they added a Q chip here, and they added a Q avatar. So that is one of the ways to customize your drop-down content. So aside from that, the drop-downs also have a native filtering and autocomplete features. In order to implement that, simply need to add, let's say, like this one, right? So in order to implement a autocomplete, what you need to do is you need to add a filter function. So the filter function is what allows you to filter contents for your drop-downs. So in this case, if I type, let's say, G, it's going to show this string right here as an example. So you have a basic, in order to create a filter, you need to create a filter function by filtering the value with the array themselves. So that is how you implement filtering options. So aside from that, you have a basic filtering, which is like this one. Let's say something like this one. Or you can have filtering based on two characters, let's say GO. So you can set custom filtering based on your function parameters. But you need to take note of this part wherein, in order to add a basic filter, you need to be able to type in your dropdown, right? So you might think, how can I type in a dropdown, right? Basically, you need to add a parameter which is called the use input and then the fill input, meaning it allows you to type inside a dropdown. So in our example, let's say use input. What happens is, if you add a use input property there, you can now type in your dropdown. And then let's say fill input. What fill input does is, if you take a look at their API up here, the fill input allows the dropdown to fill the input with the current value. So that is the capabilities of a dropdown that allows basic filtering, meaning it has a filter function, right? So going back, So where is it? So we have the filter. Okay, so here. So we have a filter, right? So you can also add a autocomplete feature in your dropdown. So in order to add an autocomplete, you need to create a function that allows you to filter the content as well based on your input string. So it all needs a function in order to filter out the content of the array which matches your input string which is in the dropdown, right? So in a sense, it behaves similarly to filtering. They both filter content, but the way they filter content is different from each other. So you also, aside from the filtering in autocomplete, you also have the option to create new values. What that means is, in this example, let's say add, I type add and then enter, I can add new values to my dropdown based on my input. Let's say subtract. So as you can see, I can add specific options to my dropdown without the use of the options array. So let's say in this case, you have the add unique. So let's say I type add and then I type add again. It's not going to append the same value twice. But in the previous one, which is in this case here, if I type add again, it's going to add the same value even though it's a duplicate one. So that's the difference between the add and the add unique. So you also have the toggle mode. Let's say add, like that. And if I type add again, it's going to remove the value. So in order to implement a feature like that, you need to add a new value mode. Meaning, you can add a parameter which is called new value mode. Let's say add. So since we have an input already, let's say I want to type here indigo. As you can see, we can add our custom values to our dropdown. In the case of, you don't want, or rather you can't define everything, so you can simply set it like this. So let's say violet. I can add values here as well. So, and then if I click the X button, they all disappear from the dropdown as well. So aside from that, you can also handle the new value event by simply listening on that property. So you simply listen to the at new value and then you can pass a function to it in order to handle that event based on what you want to perform. So in this example, let's say you want to use the menu and then you want to filter, let's say Google, Facebook, or something like that. And then let's say Apple. So that is one example, right? So you can combine filtering with the addition of values. So you can create some sort of a search option with your dropdown in this example. Also, aside from that, you also have sanitation. So by default, all options, including the selected ones, are sanitized by Quasar. So you don't have to worry about sanitation that much anymore because Quasar already sanitizes all of their values by default. So in the case of you want to, let's say, set in HTML content to your dropdown, you can get something like this. So by default, they are sanitized, right? So as you can see, they are sanitized. So you don't have that much, or it doesn't render HTML values. But in the case of in HTML form, it's going to look like this. So it's not sanitized. But there are several use cases that you want to do just that. But our general recommendation is to not add options that are arbitrary in the first place. We suggest that in order to avoid certain problems arising from that specific choice, right? Next, you also have render performance. So what do you mean by render performance? Basically, if you add, let's say, 1,000 values in your dropdown, the render performance is not affected that much unless you use the certain parameter match up or rather map options So in that case, it's going to map all of the values in your dropdown. But if you don't add a map options value, it's not going to affect your performance at all, even if you add, let's say, 10,000 or 100,000 rows in your dropdown. So you don't have to worry about that one. So one tip of Quasar, in case you want to do just that, is to get the what they say here is to get the performance while using lots of options. You can freeze the array that you are using as the options in order to conserve the checking of view and in order to avoid view making those values responsive to changes. Because let's say in those kinds of examples, you rarely change the values of those hundred thousands of options. Since you don't want them changing that much, you can simply freeze the array in order to make it not that responsive in terms of view capabilities, right? So it's not responsive in terms of view. So if you take a look at this example, they have 100,000 options. And right now I'm scrolling at around, let's say, that's plenty. So I'm currently around 999 row and I'm still going. As you can see, I can keep on going. And right now I'm at the 4,000 or rather somewhere close to 4,000 value. So and aside from that, it's still not yet even flinching. So as you can see, it doesn't affect performance that much at all. So in this case, or rather, one feature of the drop-downs also is the keyboard navigation. So you can navigate your drop-downs using the keyboard controls. In this case, if you press enter, arrow down or space, it's going to open the list of options. Or when the use chip is set, if you press the shift tab, it will navigate backwards through the Q chips. So you can use this combination of keyboard controls in order to navigate your drop-downs. So you have arrow up and arrow down to select items. You also have page up and page down. You also have home and end. You can use enter and space again. So you have these keyboard controls right here. Lastly, in case you want to use the native submit feature, you can also do that. So you can, in the case of, let's say, Quasar in combination with ASP.NET controllers, so you need a native form submit for that, right? So in this case, you need to add an action and a method to your form. And also, you need to specify a name property on your QSelect in order to achieve that kind of functionality. So what happens is all values are converted to string in that case. So what they recommend is to never use object values in the first place because the form submit uses the native functionality, which is by default accepts only string values. Thank you guys for watching this video. If you see that this has helped you in any way, please feel free to leave a like as well as to hit that subscribe button down below. If you have any further questions or if you have clarifications, please don't hesitate to leave a comment. Again, this is Joshua from Pixelate. See you later, Pixelators!